Response to that? I found that very interesting. Not necessarily surprising, just interesting.
About the releasing the juror identification
No,
or
not
the
by
absence?
no. The fact that race didn't play a role at all in any of the jurors' mind when they went into that deliberating room.
Well, that's what is so insidious about the whole discussion, in that nobody is going to express their opinion that they have got to take race into account. There's an implicit bias, not by virtue of the fact that you had a black victim, but that you have a politically and socioeconomically powerless victim who happens to be of color, and it's the elephant in the room that here you have, the powers of the state armed with a guy down on the ground, knee in the neck, taking his breath away until he dies. Does anybody really believe that he would have done this to a white guy in a trench coat holding a Wall Street Journal? Never. It's an implicit bias that nobody really discusses, but it is the elephant in the room, and it does exist. Now, I'm not going to say that they held that against Chauvin. I think he just went down on the evidence.
Yeah, I think whoever was on the ground that day, black or white, had it played out the same way. And I think you're right, it probably wouldn't have had it been a different person or different type of person, clearly. But I think the actions, they spoke for themselves. 9 minutes, 29 seconds or whatever it was, clearly spoke for itself. But what's interesting is, and I agree with you, it's all implicit. But to me, that's what voir dire is about, right? You want to really find out whose implicit bias is so strong that they can't look at it fairly. And if you do your job in voir dire, then you get jurors who may have implicit bias, understand implicit bias, but can still be fair. And when they get into that jury room, they do their job based on the facts and evidence.
Yes, I agree. And sometimes you have to ask that very pointed question. You know, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear evidence that there was a victim who was African American. By show of hands, does anybody here believe that just because there is a victim who is of color, that the defendant is more likely than not guilty? Raise your hands. But I don't think anybody asked those types of pointed, hard, focused questions. I think they instead just asked general questions. Can you be fair? Can you be impartial? Will you be objective? Will you not have any prefixed notions of, what the outcome will be? Rather than the real, pointed, actual, hard questions. And then what do we end up with? Probably an implicit bias.
Yeah, that's interesting. But clearly, one thing that I think we can agree upon here is that when jurors get into that deliberating room, certainly they bring their life experiences with them, but they do get very focused in on doing the job that is given to them to do, meaning they look at the jury instructions, they look at the evidence, and they do that job. And part of the system is your peers, and your peers, part of that definition, I think, means you bring your life experiences in there with you.
Yes, and listen, at the end of the day, this was not even close. You watch that 9-minute video, it almost reminded me of somebody deflating like one of those rubber rafts that you have in a swimming pool. You just keep sucking all the air out of it until eventually it's no longer floating. That's what he did to George Floyd. And, your eyes do not deceive you. You see it right before you. It was unmistakable. And I think at that point, race did not matter. All you had was a man losing his life over a misdemeanor, forgery or passing a bad $20 bill.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we have another case coming up, the Arbery case, and a video is at the center of that. A lot of the potential jurors that have been in voir dire have said, I look at that video and they're guilty. That video may speak for itself. But we're going to look at that issue when we come back. So, Philip, stand by. When we return, we have our Daily Talk Back question.